In the summer of 1896, the men who walked down to the edge of the Niagara River each morning believed they understood exactly what they were building. They had seen the plans, the blueprints, the proud engravings in newspapers showing turbines the size of houses and generators that would, so they were told, drag the United States into a new electric age. They knew where the tunnel should go, what rock should be removed, and where the water would finally crash through to spin the greatest hydropower system the world had ever seen. They believed they were pioneers. They had no idea they were about to trespass into someone else's infrastructure. It began with a void that should not have been there. The first shafts were sunk on the American side, steel scaffolding braced against the cliffs, blasting crews eating through the shale and limestone with the slow confidence of men who measured progress in feet per day. The surveyors had mapped the strata, calculated the gradients, traced every contour from the river surface down to the bedrock. They knew what their drills should hit. And then, one morning, they hit nothing at all. The foreman on that shift later described it, in a report that would never be published, as a drop in the earth. The hand auger should have met packed sediment, compacted stone, the resistant body of the gorge. Instead, the bit surged forward, weightless, as if it had broken through a thin shell into open air. The drill string shuddered, then dangled freely. There was no grinding resistance, no crunch of fractured stone. Only a strange, hollow resonance, like tapping a wall, and discovering that it belongs to a room you never knew your house contained. At first, they suspected a mismeasured shaft, a void caused by earlier erosion, or an unnoticed karst pocket. Such things existed. The engineers, all trained in the neat logic of American geology, scribbled possible explanations into their notebooks. But when they lowered a lantern on a cable into the opening, the light kept going. 10 feet, 20, 50. The flame stayed steady, barely flickering. If this was a natural cave, it was the strangest anyone on that site had ever seen. When the lantern finally swayed against something solid, the sound that rose up the shaft was not the dull thud of metal on stone. It was a ring, clear, crisp, controlled. A man-made sound, emerging from a place no man, according to every record, had ever built. The workers at the rim exchanged glances. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else asked if this meant they'd have to stop work, if some inspector would shut the site down and send them home without pay. No one voiced the thought that was quietly forming behind their eyes. If there was already structure here, already void, already space, then what exactly were they tunneling into? The official decision was pragmatic, almost brutally so. The schedule could not slip. The investors in New York and Boston were impatient for returns. The newspapers had already promised the public that Niagara would soon be harnessed like a tamed beast, turned from wild cataract into obedient current humming along copper wires. A delay, especially one caused by anomalous subsurface conditions, would be intolerable. So the engineers, with their tidy diagrams and their slide rules, did something that even they suspected they might one day regret. They widened the hole. The cable came back up with the lantern dented on one side and streaked with dark residue. The smell clinging to the metal was not the cool mineral breath of a cave. It was dry, oily, faintly metallic, like dust that had not been disturbed for a very long time. They sent down a man next, a slim, wiry driller who had spent half his life underground and considered fear a luxury for people who worked on the surface. He disappeared into the shaft with a rope around his waist and a carbide lamp on his helmet, carrying nothing but a handpick, a notebook, and a whistle. What he described when they finally hauled him back up did not match any map in the company archives, any sketch in the city's records, or any memory among the aging canal diggers who had cut their way through almost every other inch of rock along the river. Hallways. That was the word he used first. "There's hallways down there," he said, eyes unfocused, voice flat, "and they're cleaner than ours." He tried to explain through the fatigue and the disbelief. The shaft, he said, opened into a passage that ran parallel to the river, not carved but constructed. The walls were too straight, too smooth. No chisel marks, no blast scars, no rough-hewn texture of 19th-century rockwork. Instead, he felt his gloved hand slide along surfaces that were cold and even, broken only by narrow horizontal seams that repeated at perfect intervals, like courses of masonry so fine the joints vanished unless you knew where to look. The floor was level in a way that nature never is. His boot soles clicked, not on bare stone, but on something that sounded faintly hollow beneath its own weight. He said there were recesses along the corridor, regularly spaced alcoves that once might have held equipment, or lamps, or something more complex he could not even name. No stalactites, no seepage, no dripping water accumulated over centuries. Everything was dry, sealed, preserved, as if whoever built it had not intended to let the river touch it at all. As if the Niagara Gorge, for all its roaring violence just yards away, was nothing more than superficial noise above a controlled, silent system they had buried and then abandoned. The engineers listened, then carefully chose what they would write down and what they would let vanish between the lines. They recorded void discovered, subsurface cavity, non-conforming geological feature. They did not write tunnel or chamber or corridor. They did not mention the regular spacing of the alcoves, the uniform junctions, or the faint metallic tang clinging to the air. Officially, this was an inconvenience. Unofficially, it was a trespass. Whatever lay beneath them was older than their plans and more advanced than any infrastructure they had ever seen, and they had just punched a hole straight into its roof. Part 2. Too modern for 1896. By the time a second crew went down, the shaft had been widened enough to allow two men to climb side by side, their lamps casting overlapping circles of light against the smooth opening. This time, they went equipped not as miners, but as reluctant surveyors of someone else's work. They carried measuring tapes, plumb lines, chalk, and a hastily borrowed transit which, in the confined space, was more for comfort than precision. The foreman had been explicit. No sketches left lying around, no casual talk in the taverns after shift. "You saw a cave," he'd told them. "If anyone asks, that's all." But what waited below resisted that word with every detail of its geometry. The corridor was wider than the first man had managed to describe in his shock, high enough that even the tallest of them, stretching his arm upward with a measuring rod, could not brush the ceiling. The proportions were, in an unnerving way, generous. Not just functional, no cramped utility tunnel cut to the exact minimum needed for human passage, but overbuilt, as if the scale had been chosen for a larger operator, or for machinery that required clearance far beyond what any 1890s work crew would demand. On one side, the wall was unbroken for as far as their lamps could cast light, a smooth plane that swallowed illumination rather than scattering it. The seam lines, they found, were hair-thin, so regular that one of the men joked, weakly, about a stonecutter who could slice rock like cheese. On the other side, at intervals that soon proved to be exactly repeating, the wall stepped inward into those alcoves the first man had mentioned. Each recess was identical in dimension, depth, and height. Each one terminated in a flattened back surface that bore faint parallel grooves at the same height from the floor, as though something had once been mounted there in a standardized way, clipped or locked into position, then removed with methodical care. They tried, out of sheer habit, to fit what they saw into their own vocabulary. Perhaps this had been an old drainage tunnel, they suggested, some forgotten scheme to divert seepage or abandon a canal beneath the river. But there were no watermarks, no mineral deposits, no evidence of long-term flow. No one bored a tunnel like this to let water through. This was built to keep something out. It was the floor that most unsettled them. The soles of their boots told them more than any instrument could. There was a give, the slightest resonance, under each step. Not enough to suggest fragility, but enough to imply hollow space beneath. A plenum, a channel, a void. When one of them, against orders, chipped at the surface, the flakes that came free were thinner than slate and lighter than any stone he'd worked with. Beneath, the pick struck something that rang like a bell. The sound itself was small, but in that silence it carried. It was not the dull knock of steel on random stone. It had a pitch, a sustained vibration that lingered in the air just longer than it should have. The men exchanged a look they pretended not to understand. A floor that sounded like a composite shell over a cavity. A hallway whose acoustics felt tuned rather than incidental. Later, when they climbed back up and had to remember how to be ordinary workmen again, one of them would try to explain it to his wife by comparing it to walking across the floor above a grand concourse in a city terminal. How the sound seems to collect and travel along hidden beams and hollow roots you never see. Except here, below Niagara, there was no documented concourse, no station, no public face, only an underside. The few engineers brave enough to let their curiosity show began whispering comparisons they would never dare write. The evenly spaced alcoves could have been niches for insulated cylinders, massive switchgear, or transformer-like elements, if such terms had existed in their vocabulary. The grooves at identical heights suggested brackets for conduits or bus bars. The sealed dryness, so close to the river's aggression, spoke of an understanding of hydrostatic pressure and waterproofing well in advance of anything the 1890s textbooks hinted at. It was, to the few who allowed themselves to say it out loud, too modern for the year printed at the top of their survey sheets. But this was not a world that welcomed the phrase too modern. It was an era that prided itself on being the summit of progress. The same newspapers that ran engravings of the planned turbines at Niagara framed the United States as the spearhead of global industry, wresting power from nature in ways no prior age had achieved. To admit that just beneath the bedrock, someone else had already built a system more orderly, more seamless, more integrated than anything Westinghouse's men could design, that would require an honesty that had no place in company reports or patriotic speeches. So the language turned evasive. Anomalous excavations, one internal memo called it, as if the rock had somehow excavated itself. Legacy work of unknown origin, suggested another, cautiously pushing the anomaly backwards in time in the hope that it would dissolve into vagueness. The more precise the men's descriptions became, repeating modules, uniform tolerances, sealed interfaces, the more vague the official vocabulary grew. A tunnel that looked like a conduit gallery for an underground electrical system became, in print, a subterranean cavity of indeterminate purpose. Conveniently, indeterminate purposes could be ignored. The workers, for their part, developed their own vernacular. Some called it the underrun, imagining it as a secret bypass that let the river's force travel unseen, like current in a buried cable. Others preferred the electric catacombs, half joking, half serious, as if the place itself held a charge. None of them could shake the impression that the corridor was not a ruin, but an idle machine, switched off, disconnected, but still fundamentally intact. As though the thrusting new hydropower plant they had been hired to carve into the rock was not the first system to tap Niagara's power, but the second. The foreman who had first sent a man down began sleeping poorly. He would wake with the image of those alcoves lined with cylinders of unknown design, the floor vibrating faintly under a flow of energy he could only imagine. He suspected, though he never said so, that they had not discovered the beginning of something, but the end of it, the husk of a network whose surface nodes had long since been dismantled or buried. The river roared above, proudly uncontained. Below it, in that silent corridor, lay the suggestion of a time when Niagara's fury had been captured, routed, and distributed through systems whose remnants his crew now scuffed with muddy boots. The company eventually sent an official delegation, civil engineers, a company lawyer, a man from Buffalo who asked too few questions and took too many notes. They went down, spent less than an hour in the corridor, and came up with faces so carefully blank that every worker on the rim knew they had seen something that would never make it into public record. The next morning, A new directive was posted at the site. All work encountering subterranean intervals inconsistent with survey expectations would be reported directly to the chief engineer. No photographs were to be taken underground. No sketches retained by individual workers. The anomaly had been seen. Now it would be managed. Part 3. The network beneath the falls. Once you accept the corridor as intentional, everything around Niagara in 1896 begins to look different. The men at the surface still saw the project in terms of turbines and penstocks and generator halls, but a few of the younger engineers, those who had gone to universities where Maxwell's equations were whispered about like incantations, started to entertain a darker, more compelling possibility. What if what they had entered through that accidental shaft was not an isolated feature, but the surviving limb of a larger system? They began, discreetly, to look for patterns. The corridor, as far as they could trace it without provoking the ire of their superiors, ran roughly parallel to the river before curving gently inland. Its alignment did not match the planned water conduits of the new plant. It predated those lines, ignored them, crossed them. Where the newer project envisioned 3 great tunnels feeding a central powerhouse, the old corridor followed an older logic, a geometry that seemed less concerned with the most efficient route for water and more with maintaining a constant depth and orientation. It felt, one engineer wrote in a private notebook, like a trunk line, as if the Niagara Gorge itself had once been a node on an invisible grid. Rumors seeped in from other projects. A telegraph operator in Buffalo mentioned, over a late-night drink, that a crew digging foundations for a new line tower had broken into dry works below the water table, brick-lined galleries that could not be accounted for in any municipal plan. A cousin, working on a canal lock a state away, spoke of discovering sealed conduits whose surfaces were too precise to be the work of local masons. Each story, on its own, could be dismissed as exaggeration or misremembered detail. Together, they hummed with resonance. The Niagara corridor had features that no natural cave could mimic. In some sections, the ceiling flattened into a near-perfect arch, the curve so regular that even by lamplight the engineers could trace its radius with their eyes. In other sections, the tunnel expanded into chambers whose proportions were, there was no other word for it, architectural. Not in the sense of ornament, for there were no carvings or decorations, but in the sense of deliberate human-centered geometry. Even empty, long stripped of whatever fixtures had once anchored to the grooves and brackets along the walls, the chambers felt designed for something specific. One room, oval in plan and longer than a city trolley car, bore the faint scars of something once having been mounted at its center. A ring of anchoring points sunk into the floor around a now empty circle. When one of the more imaginative workers stood at its edge and clapped his hands, the returning echo carried a strange filtered quality, emphasizing some frequencies and swallowing others. It was as if the very shape had been tuned, like the resonant belly of an instrument. A practical man might call it coincidence. A more honest man might admit that it felt like standing inside part of a machine whose operating manual had been burned. What kind of system would need such a corridor beneath the most powerful waterfall on the continent? The obvious answer, to men living in the dawning electric age, was energy. But not the crude, mechanical kind their turbine shafts would soon convert, water pressure into rotation, rotation into spinning dynamos. This had the feel of something subtler, more direct, as if the river's potential had once been tapped in a way that bypassed clanking turbines entirely. A hidden infrastructure that treated Niagara not just as a source of motion, but as a node in a broader atmospheric or electrical scheme. To ordinary citizens in 1896, electricity was still a novelty. Arc lamps in city squares, incandescent bulbs in rich men's houses, the occasional thrill of a trolley gliding silently down a track. To those who had walked the corridor, however, electricity began to feel less like a new discovery and more like an echo. The alcoves along the walls, with their faint, scorch-like markings at identical heights, the invisible paths where dust refused to settle, as if some long-vanished field had once swept through. the meticulous sealing that kept the river's dampness forever at bay. These did not belong to an era just learning how to route current along copper wires. They hinted at a time when power, in some form, had been as integrated into the landscape as the rock itself. And yet, there were no records. No previous hydropower plant mentioned in city archives. No mention of abandoned works in the minutes of council meetings. No warnings scribbled on old maps. Subsurface constructions here. If such a system had ever existed, it had been erased from memory with a thoroughness that bordered on surgical. The only evidence left was what was too deep, too expensive, or too inconvenient to remove. The company lawyer, the man from Buffalo who took too many notes, viewed the situation through a narrower lens. Liability. Ownership. If something man-made existed beneath their concession, who owned it? Could it be claimed? Could it be blamed if things went wrong? He argued eventually for the simplest path. Deny its significance. Treat it as an old curiosity, structurally inert. Fill what needed to be filled, bridge what needed to be bridged. Never admit that they had glimpsed a system whose sophistication made their proud new plant look provincial. The response from those above him, the men whose names appeared in financial pages, was even starker. The United States was in the middle of defining its narrative of modernity. Niagara was to be a symbol, a proof that American industry could take the raw chaos of nature and turn it into ordered light. There was no room in that story for whispers of a previous network buried beneath their feet. No space for the suggestion that they were, in fact, refurbishing an older node rather than establishing the first. So the decision crystallized, quietly, in conference rooms lined with polished wood and maps that showed only what was convenient. The corridor was not to exist, not in public. Internally, it would be treated as an obstruction. Structurally, it would be treated as a gap to be stabilized. Conceptually, it would be treated as a threat, not because it posed physical danger, but because it threatened the story on which the entire hydropower project had been sold. Some engineers objected mildly. They argued for documentation, for a proper survey, for at least a sealed record placed in some archive against the day when future generations might, perhaps, be ready to ask the questions they were being told not to ask. They were overruled. Progress, especially the kind you can show to investors and newspapers, rarely has patience for inconvenient questions about prior art. Yet the corridor remained, stubbornly real, beneath the slur of euphemisms and the weight of silence. Men still had to pass through its margins to blast their own rougher tunnels. They still heard that faint, bell-like ring when their tools bit too deep in the wrong place. They still felt, in their boots, the difference between rock that had never been touched and rock that had once been carved with a precision they could not match. Above ground, the future was being built in brick and steel. Below, the past refused to be entirely forgotten. If this was a network, Niagara was not its center. It was a junction, one node among many. That realization, more than anything, terrified those few who allowed themselves to follow its implications. Because if there was one such corridor under the falls, who could say how many more lay beneath other rivers, other dams, other hydro plants already rising across the United States? How many times, without knowing, had American crews drilled into the skeleton of a vanished system and mistaken it for an anomaly, a nuisance, a geological quirk? Part 4. Burying the proof. The act of erasure did not happen all at once. It unfolded in small practical decisions that, at the time, could be defended as sensible engineering choices. The first of these was ostensibly about safety. The underground corridor, with its unexpected hollows and resonant floor, posed a risk to the integrity of the new tunnels they were blasting. Or so the chief engineer stated in a memorandum that would, decades later, be quietly removed from the company records. The solution, he wrote, was straightforward: backfill. They began at the shaft they had cut, the accidental wound that had opened the corridor to the light for the first time in no one knew how long. Loads of aggregate were hauled to the rim. broken rock from the ongoing excavations, mixed with sand and whatever debris accumulated conveniently close to hand. It was poured into the opening in stages, tamped and compacted, allowed to settle. The men who had walked that silent hallway watched as their only legal access point shrank, layer by layer, into a scar of packed rubble. Officially, this was grouting, stabilization, due diligence. Unofficially, it was burial. The corridor itself was too extensive to fill entirely. That would have required a project nearly as large as the hydropower plant itched to displace it. Instead, they sealed the points of contact. Every accidental breakthrough into the old space was plugged. Every fissure was filled. Where the planned water tunnels intersected the ancient void, they built thick bulkheads of concrete, casting them in place against the smooth walls of the older construction and pretending not to notice how cleanly the new material bonded to the old, as if it recognized a kindred structural logic. The backfill crews joked, as workers always do when forced to do something they do not fully understand. They called it stuffing the ghosts, as if they were packing unwanted spirits back into a tomb. Some, more superstitious, muttered that you should never seal something that had remained open for so long. Others, caught between curiosity and the need for their wages, shrugged and shoveled. They had families to feed. Mysteries did not put bread on the table. On the surface, the story congealed into a simpler shape. When local reporters, tipped off by tavern gossip about strange finds underground, visited the site, they were shown the turbines, the penstocks, the visible achievements. When they asked if anything unexpected had been discovered during excavation, the chief engineer smiled tightly and mentioned, "Some voids in the rock, nothing of consequence." The narrative held. Niagara was being tamed, modernized, electrified, for the first time according to every article that went to press. Privately, the company circulated a small, tightly controlled packet of documents, rough sketches of the corridor, notes on its dimensions, a summary of the decision to seal it. The packet was marked for internal reference only, not to be shared beyond a handful of senior staff. Its purpose, at least nominally, was to ensure that future maintenance crews would be aware of the stabilized zones beneath their feet. In practice, it served as a confession sealed in an envelope, evidence that they had known something was there and chosen, consciously, to bury it. Over time, even that packet began to fray at the edges of memory. Staff turned over. New engineers came in who knew only the clean story. The construction of a pioneering hydropower plant on solid, well-surveyed rock. The older men retired or died, taking with them the bodily knowledge of that strange hollowness beneath the falls. The corridor did not vanish, but the people who had walked it did. The last living witnesses became old men with reputations to protect and grandchildren who preferred baseball stories to tales of electric catacombs. Niagara was not unique in this quiet pattern. As other dams rose across the country in the early 20th century, on the Columbia, the Colorado, the Tennessee, similar whispers surfaced among the crews, unexpected voids. Old work discovered at impossible depths, walls too straight, floors too regular, cavities too dry beneath levels where groundwater should have claimed every inch of space. Each time, the official response was nearly identical. Assess structural risk, plug what must be plugged, move on. The United States was busy building its visible grid, hoovering rivers into reservoirs, stringing transmission lines across valleys, studding landscapes with transformer yards. There was no appetite for stories suggesting that deep below, some other grid had once existed and been erased. Memory itself became a kind of reservoir to be dammed. Newspapers that had once cheerfully printed slight oddities, reports of fossilized timbers in strange patterns, or brick-like formations uncovered below riverbeds, began to filter their content more aggressively. Editors learned, through a mixture of explicit pressure and implicit expectation, what not to amplify. In the age of progress, anomalies were bad for business. By the time mid-century approached, the original Niagara plant had already undergone expansions and modifications. Concrete encased concrete. New tunnels bypassed old ones. The sealed interfaces with the ancient corridor became just one more layer within a growing palimpsest of engineering decisions. Even if a maintenance crew had accidentally drilled into the old space again, they would have encountered not a pristine hallway but a patchwork of partial fills and hybrid wall sections, difficult to read, easy to dismiss as old construction. The most significant burial, however, was not of rock and tunnel, but of questions. Why would anyone prior to the 19th century have built an underground system beneath Niagara, so meticulously aligned and sealed? What had it carried? Water, air, energy of a kind we no longer cultivate? How widespread had such systems been? Were they local oddities, or fragments of a network spanning the continent? And, perhaps most unsettlingly, who had ordered it dismantled, disconnected, and left to sleep in darkness, only for American progress to stumble into it by accident? The men in 1896 had neither the language nor the political freedom to explore those questions. They were, in a sense, good citizens of their age, loyal to the story that their nation told itself. The idea that the United States might be building its proud dams and hydro plants atop the skeleton of a forgotten technological civilization would have sounded, even to them, like madness. Easier, then, to let the dust settle, to pour in the rubble, to tell themselves that the ring of their picks on those resonant floors had been nothing more than an oddity. Yet buried questions have a way of generating pressure, like water behind a dam. Each new discovery at other sites, each quiet report of modern-looking tunnel work at inexplicable depths added to that unseen reservoir. The official story held, on the surface. Below, in the minds of a handful of engineers, drillers, and surveyors scattered across the growing hydroelectric empire, a different narrative slowly began to take shape. One in which Niagara's invisible corridor was not an aberration, but a clue. Part 5. The Pattern Across the Dams. By the 1930s, a new generation of American engineers had taken the stage, men who had grown up with electric light as a given and believed that the great dams they were designing would stand as monuments for 1,000 years. They spoke with slick confidence about megawatts and load factors, about flood control and agricultural uplift. They saw rivers as variables in equations, not as places with histories. And yet, almost despite themselves, some of them stumbled onto the same forbidden pattern that had surfaced at Niagara 4 decades earlier. At Hoover Dam, workers driving side tunnels into the canyon walls spoke of sections of rock that, when blasted, revealed voids too regular to be chance. Most were small. Short stretches of smooth-sided cavities, intersected obliquely by the new tunnels. Official reports labeled them geological anomalies, attributing their planes and flatness to differential erosion or unusual stratification. The men underground knew better. They had dug enough caves and shafts to recognize natural irregularity. These were something else: clean, planar, or sealed. In the Pacific Northwest, on the Columbia, similar stories filtered into private correspondence. Crews found, beneath the sediment and basalt, galleries whose alignment did not match any known fault line or lava tube. In Tennessee, under the TVA's proud multi-purpose dams, rumors circulated among local workers of old brick tunnels cut straight through what should have been virgin rock. Each time, the phenomena were treated as curiosities at best, embarrassments at worst. The official stance hardened into a reflex. Anything that did not fit the approved geological model was to be folded into that model by force, or quietly ignored. But consider the possibility that Niagara was not a one-off, not a freak exception, but the first documented glimpse of something systemic. To see that, you have to step back from individual anomalies and look at the map, the same way one of those early surveyors might have if he'd allowed his imagination to outpace his orders. Imagine plotting the great American hydropower sites, not just the famous icons like Niagara and Hoover, but the dozens of lesser dams scattered across the country. Then imagine overlaying onto that same map every credible report of strange subterranean works encountered during their construction. Voids at impossible depths. Corridors more precise than the tools of their day. Chambers with tuned acoustics. In the official histories, these are footnotes at best, if they appear at all. On such a map, they might form something else entirely. A lattice. Not a perfect grid, of course. Nothing built in the real world ever is. But a pattern hinting that rivers were once treated as more than just sources of falling water. That certain falls, narrows, and gorges, Niagara among them, were chosen long ago as nodes in a network that harnessed forces we now only partially understand. A network whose traces survive only where later builders happen to cut too deep and glimpse the bones beneath. At Niagara in 1896, the corridor under the falls seemed like an isolated curiosity. Today, with the benefit of hindsight and accumulated anomalies, it looks more like a prototype, a local expression of a broader principle. Bury the true infrastructure deep, seal it, and hide its access points under natural violence. A waterfall is noisy, destructive, constantly reshaping its own face. What better cover for a stable system that must remain undisturbed? The roar above distracts attention from the silence below. If that is the case, then the decision to bury the Niagara corridor in rubble and concrete takes on a darker cast. The men of 1896 may have believed they were stabilizing an inconvenient void, but viewed from another angle, they were participating, unknowingly, in a second burial. The first burial had occurred when whoever built those halls and alcoves shut down their system and walked away, sealing their own accesses. The second occurred when American progress, in its rush to christen itself as the first true master of Niagara's power, layered its own crude machinery atop that sleeping skeleton, and then deliberately choked off the few accidental windows into it. We have, in effect, inherited a landscape that may already have been wired, just not in ways we recognize. Our dams and hydro plants, proud feats of 20th century engineering, could be merely surface-level modifications slapped onto the remains of a deeper, older grid. The turbines spin, the generators hum, the transmission lines buzz. But all the while, beneath the concrete foundations and bolted steel, there may lie corridors like the one under Niagara, empty now, or perhaps just idle, waiting for a form of activation that no one alive remembers how to initiate. Which brings us to the question that no official report at Niagara allowed itself to print, but which every man who walked that hidden hallway must have felt pressing against his ribs. If there was one invisible civilization's footprint under the falls, how many more lie under the concrete of America's dams? How many electric catacombs have we unknowingly walled up under reservoirs and spillways? How many corridors packed with rubble and forgotten in the name of progress? Part 6. How many catacombs? Stand for a moment on the American side of Niagara as it is today. The air vibrates with the fall's endless impact. Tourists lean over railings, snapping photographs of the water's white fury. Few give any thought to what lies below the surfaces they can see. The thick concrete of the hydro plant intakes, the channels carved by engineers in 1896 and after, and deeper still, the sealed interfaces where new work once kissed something much older. The corridor is gone to them. It has been transformed from a physical reality into an absence, a story that exists only as rumor in the margins of forgotten reports. Now, stretch that scene outward, across the entire United States. From the low-slung dams of the southeast to the towering walls of concrete in the west, from the modest hydro stations on New England rivers to the massive powerhouses on the Columbia, each structure sits astride a reshaped river, each priding itself on the modernity it represents. Each was built by men who believed they were the first to turn falling water into electricity at that site. Each cut into rock that had, supposedly, never before felt the bite of human tools at such depths. Yet, we have these recurring anomalies: Niagara's corridor, Hoover's geological plains, the Columbia's sealed galleries, the TVA's inexplicable tunnels. We have the same pattern of response: initial curiosity, followed by euphemism, followed by burial. We have, above all, a cultural reflex that insists on seeing the present as the pinnacle and anything that challenges that assumption as either error or threat. So, when you ask how many such electric catacombs lie beneath American dams and hydro plants, the honest answer is brutal in its simplicity. We do not know. We do not know because we have chosen, repeatedly, not to know. We have filled the holes, shredded the memos, retired the witnesses, and smoothed the narrative. We have built monuments to our own ingenuity on foundations we never fully examined, then congratulated ourselves on being the first to tame rivers that may have been quietly harnessed long before our maps bore any names at all. Is Niagara unique? The evidence whispers otherwise. That corridor in 1896 radiated the same unsettling qualities reported at other sites: geometry too perfect, dryness too absolute, infrastructure too seamlessly integrated into the surrounding rock to fit the improvised, rough-hewn methods of 19th and early 20th century crews. It felt less like a human hack and more like a design principle, replicated perhaps wherever certain conditions were met: a major drop, a stable bedrock, a need for concealed access to immense, continuous power. If even a fraction of America's major dams conceal such remnants, if under a handful of those concrete walls and intake towers there lie sealed corridors and empty alcoves humming with the memory of a forgotten grid, then our entire relationship to our own infrastructure changes. The grid we see, lines, substations, plants, is not necessarily the first grid. It might be at best a patchwork repair, a partial reactivation, or a crude replacement for something more elegant. At worst, it is an unwitting layer of noise thrown over a system we never bothered to understand before burying. There is a bitter irony in this. In 1896, the men at Niagara thought they were discovering the future. In reality, they may have brushed their fingers against the past, a past in which civilization had already mastered the art of routing energy through rock and water in ways we can only guess at. When they chose to seal that corridor, they weren't just closing a tunnel, they were closing a question. That question is still there, waiting in the dark under tons of concrete, under churning spillways and carefully calculated penstocks. How many more corridors like that run beneath our feet? How many more too modern vaults sleep behind grouted bulkheads and forgotten survey lines? How much of our proud, visible hydropower empire rests on top of a deeper, invisible one we inherited without acknowledgement? And the most unsettling thought of all, if an earlier civilization once tapped Niagara and other rivers through hidden networks, if they built an integrated system of underground halls, conduits, and resonance chambers and then walked away from it, what did they know that we do not? What failure? What danger? What shift in the world made them shut off their grid and bury their own catacombs beneath the roar of the falls?